Hi, welcome to our virtual walk. My name is Michelle Diaz. I'm the Education Program Manager at Trees Atlanta. Our agenda for today includes welcoming an introduction, and then we're going to be watching a 15-minute video from the Stumpery, and then we're going to have an opportunity for questions. Then Kelly, our speaker for today, will give you a virtual tour. She'll be walking the Stumpery. She'll be answering more questions. Trees Atlanta mission is to protect and improve Atlanta's urban forest by planting, conservation, and education. We thank you for joining us and supporting us. We host events like this one year round. And during this current situation, we're hosting them virtually. Visit our website for more information on upcoming events. If you have a question, please use the chat tool or the Q&A tool to direct questions to the speaker. I'll be your moderator today. And also Dana Render, our Director of Education, will be reading questions for the speaker during the event. We will love your feedback. Virtual tours are something new for us, so we will love your feedback and see if you're interested in any specific topics or spaces that we should be covering during these virtual events. You'll be receiving an email after this class with a survey link. Please complete the survey to let us know how it goes. I wanted to highlight two upcoming events. Next Saturday, we're going to be having a virtual workshop. One of our volunteers, Scott Braslow, is going to be doing a workshop from his home to show us how to protect trees' critical root zone. Also on July 27, he'll be showing us how to identify invasive species. To register and to find more information about other events, visit treesatlanta.org/calendar. And we invite you to follow us on social media and also sign up for our newsletter to learn about upcoming events and opportunities. Our speaker today is Kelly Ridenhour. She is our Associate Director of Design. And again, we're going to be covering a 15-minute video, and then there'll be opportunities for questions. And then we're going to be doing a walk and more opportunities for questions. So please use the chat and the Q&A to submit your questions. Just so you have an idea of where the BeltLine extends, all this green line over here, this loop, that is what the BeltLine is. It's 22 miles when completed, and Kelly will go over this also. And where the Stumpery is located, right here in the East Side Extension Trail, around this area between Wiley and Kirkwood Avenue. So now we're going to start with the video.
Welcome, I'm Kelly Ridenhour, Associate Director of Design at Trees Atlanta, and we're standing in the BeltLine Arboretum Stumpery Garden, located on the Atlanta BeltLine East Side Extension Trail in the Reynoldstown neighborhood, just north of Kirkwood Avenue. The Atlanta BeltLine is a transit corridor connecting 45 different neighborhoods through Atlanta across 22 miles. The entire corridor is also a certified arboretum, a free public garden where you can learn about trees. The Arboretum is home to over 4,000 newly planted trees that join the existing forest across 45 acres of meadow. The Arboretum is also interconnected with gardens, like this one, the Stumpery Garden, that are urban forest learning hotspots. Stumpery Gardens is a real term. It's an intentional arrangement of woody material like tree stumps, trunks, and branches, and the first known Stumpery was built in 1856 and created by artist and gardener Edward William Cook. Cook was an English painter known for iconic seascape paintings. However, Cook had an interest in natural history. In fact, a boa constrictor native to the Caribbean was named in Cook's honor. Cook was enlisted to help his friend, James Bateman, a famous horticulturalist known for orchid cultivation, along with his wife, Maria Bateman, a botanist, design and build the now famous gardens at Biddulph Grange in North Staffordshire. At that time, extensive land clearing left woody debris, and Cook saw an opportunity to reuse the material. The piles were turned into towering stump-adorned walls, flanking either side of the garden pathways, and planted with ferns. The various nooks and crannies between root and stump pieces created the perfect environment to grow ferns. Ferns were a growing fashion during the Victorian era. This fern fever was even given a name, Pteridomania. Ferns adorned metalwork, gravestones, artwork, just to name a few, and fern collecting and hunting was wildly popular. Charles Kingsley described this movement in his book, Glaucus, or The Wonders of the Shore. What he wrote reads, "Your daughters, perhaps, have been seized with the prevailing pteridomania and wrangling over unpronounceable names of species, which seem different in each new fern book that they buy, and yet you cannot deny that they find enjoyment in it, and are more active, more cheerful, more self-forgetful over it than they would have been over novels and gossip, crochet, and Berlin wool." With the fern craze rampant, it is no surprise that the idea of a stumpery garden immediately caught on and became common features of late 19th century gardens. These upturned roots were just the perfect scaffolding to display a home fern collection, sometimes lovingly referred to as ferneries. Victorian gardens during this time were eclectic and favored showcasing unique plants from all around the world, which made gardens appear enchantingly wild. This garden style was a stark transition from the 18th century Capability Brown style landscapes. These landscapes featured sweeping lawns planted with isolated groupings of trees, all done to make the landscape appear larger. These late 19th century Victorian gardens, which included stumperies, influenced the arts and crafts movement, which gave us the bountiful, overflowing cottage gardens in the early 20th century. These wild gardens of the 20th century disappeared due to a range of factors, which included war, bringing on social and economic changes, urbanization, modern design which favors clean lines, as well as the successful mass production of the motorized lawnmower. All of this contributed to the extinction of the Victorian and cottage gardens. With it went the stumpery. However, stumpery gardens are becoming popular again, the most famous belonging to Prince Charles at Highgrove Estate, which was built in 1980. And the largest stumpery was built at the Rhododendron Species Botanical Garden in Washington State in 2009. While stumperies are still rare horticultural oddities, they also align with the cultural gardening shifts we see today. We are favoring gardens that repair damages of the most destructive aspects of urban and suburbanization. For example, community gardens, which bring us food, wildlife habitat gardens to bring back pollinators, xeriscaping and rain gardens, both done with intentions to be responsible about water use. We strive to make our homes, gardens, and landscapes not just beautiful, but beneficial. So how does using dead wood in a landscape help? You might think of a forest as lush, green, full of life and health. While this is true, a forest requires death to survive. Without dead wood, a forest is just not the same. In recent history, we have managed our forests for timber products. For traditional timber products, you want to grow straight wood, thin the forest, and cut out any of the disease. While this is good for reliable timber production, the rest of the ecosystem that relies on trees across a variety of ages suffers. An undisturbed forest can have 140 dead logs per acre, and 10 to 20% of the forest canopy can be composed of snags. We are going to look at why this is vital for a healthy forest within 3 broad categories: wildlife, plant life, and soil. An extensive range of creatures uses dead wood as homes: foraging grounds, storage units, meeting spaces, highways, and social space. For example, over 100 species of birds and mammals rely on dead wood and tree snags as critical habitat. In North America alone, more than 80 species of birds nest in snags. Bluebirds, wood ducks, titmice, martins, great crested flycatchers, chickadees, nuthatches, barred owls, screech owls, and kestrels all depend on cavities for successful nesting. You may even be familiar with the chimney swift. Prior to the existence of chimneys on the landscape, large dead snags were often the nesting sites for chimney swifts. Bird species use snags in other ways besides nests. For example, to view their surroundings, watch for predators, prey, for rivals, to look for mates, and to hunt, especially insects, which both birds and bats are important insect predators. They also provide social space for birds, a place to communicate and meet up. For example, woodpeckers drum on hollow trunks to mark territories and to attract mates. The ruffled grouse uses fallen logs to drum their wings in a birds of paradise style dance, often returning to the same log on the forest floor year after year. Many animals move in after the birds. Think of it as a critter condo. For example, the holes pileated woodpeckers excavate allow access to flying squirrels, bats, raccoons, and many other species of bird. Large tree cavities, uprooted root wads, and fallen logs provide denning space for mammals such as rabbits, possums, fox, raccoons, wolves, bobcats, and even black bears, protecting them from harsh weather. These predators are helpful in controlling rodent and insect populations, as well as spreading the seed of our native trees. But how can a tree make a cavity large enough for a bear? Because the hollowing process in a tree is very specific. It has to begin early and start on a living tree. An already dead tree, not infected with heart rot fungus, will not become hollow. A hollow tree is created when the fungus invades the center or the heartwood of a living tree. As the tree spreads this disease vertically, the decay progresses to a point that the cylinder of dead wood eventually detaches from the surrounding layer of the tree and slumps downward. A hollow chamber results. Black bears find these and use them as den sites, and the females and their young are much safer. Tree cavities are also used by frogs, snakes, honeybees, wasps, spiders, and aquatic invertebrates. Logs that fall into rivers, streams, and wetlands provide important habitat for trout, bass, turtles, and a wide variety of other aquatic species. These fallen logs become popular sites for fish to shelter and breed. Years later, a fallen snag becomes a nurse log, where saplings find rich compost in which to grow as the decomposing logs enrich the soil. These groupings of logs may shelter young sapling trees from heavy browsing by deer or other animals, giving them a leg up. As they decay, the logs are colonized by plants and mosses, which host invertebrates such as tardigrades. Tardigrades are also lovingly known as moss piglets and water bears, and are tiny 8-legged micro animals. These animals are found in harsh environments from mountaintops to the deep sea, volcanoes, tropical rainforests, and even the Antarctic. As you can imagine, being this versatile, tardigrades are among the most resilient animals known and used in scientific research. They have been shown to survive extreme conditions, such as broad temperatures, pressures, lack of oxygen, radiation, dehydration, and starvation. All of these extremes would kill most other forms of life. Tardigrades have even survived exposure to outer space. And these little moss piglets are prevalent in mosses and lichens and feed on plant cells, algae, and even other small invertebrates. This pioneer plant community and the tiny life it harbors may not have had the same chance at survival if it weren't for these nurse logs, on which tree saplings and other plants are able to survive in. Dead and dying wood is like a time-released compost or fertilizer, which slowly releases nutrients into the soil. As they decay, the nutrients form the chemical and physical characteristics of forest soils. These characteristics are what makes healthy soil, capable of producing old-growth forests. This life cycle is fueled by the decomposing wood. An arc of plants to fungi and animals rely upon logs as a food source and a place to live. The fungus growing and fruiting on logs helps break down the wood, but also provides food for wildlife. Squirrels, chipmunk, deer, rabbits, and even humans eat mushrooms. The decomposing logs also help form mycorrhizae in the soil. These are basically fungus roots that form a symbiotic relationship with trees and help the plants share resources. More than 95% of terrestrial plant species form a symbiotic relationship with beneficial mycorrhizal fungi, and they have evolved this relationship over the past several 100 million years. These fungi are ancient, and they existed long before we had terrestrial plants like trees and grasses. This partnership allowed plants to colonize dry land and create life on Earth as we know it. This mycorrhizal relationship centers on a plant's ability to produce carbohydrates through photosynthesis. The plant shares the sugars it creates with the fungus in return for otherwise unavailable water and nutrients that are sourced from the soil. These fungal networks spiderweb through the soil and are called the wood wide web, allowing trees to communicate with each other, not through speech like we do, but by sending electrical signals to warn other trees about insect predators and passing along sugar, nitrogen, and phosphorus to other trees in need during periods of stress. Now that you know how important dead wood can be in a landscape, turn to your own home. How much healthy and unhealthy trees does your landscape have? Consider leaving the stump of your dead tree or cutting off the branches of a dead tree to leave it standing as a snag. Fallen trees can be cut up into logs and interplanted or stacked into a habitat wall. If you're in need of some inspiration on how to incorporate these elements in your own home, come visit the Stumpery Garden, located on the Eastside Extension Beltline Trail in Reynoldstown.
Am I on? Hey everyone, thanks for watching that and joining us here this morning for National Public Gardens Week. I hope you enjoyed that video. We're gonna do a walkthrough here in a minute of the Stumpery and tell you a little bit more about this. But before we start that, I wanted to ask if anyone had any questions about anything you've learned so far. And if you do, you just type it into the chat or the Q&A and they'll read it out loud to me. Just waiting for a couple minutes. If you do have a question, you can just type it in, but we'll go ahead and get started and we can stop if you've got a question. So to start here, this is our beautiful root log wall on the Stumpery garden. We will just let you pan around to it first and then I'll stop and talk about a little bit. Yeah. So these root wads are, you know, these trees, we actually worked with a arborist company who reuses a lot of wood to source these from a construction site in Atlanta where they couldn't be saved, and get to reuse them in this beautiful garden instead of them getting chipped into mulch. But these stumps here, we're actually going to end up in the first week of June. We're going to plant the entire Stumpery garden, tuck in all those nooks and crannies with little plants, and we're actually going to be wrapping these stumps in mosses. So over time, these uprooted root wads are going to kind of soften and break down and get covered and colonized with all those little plants that we're going to stuck in there and just kind of brighten up and turn green over time. So you could do this, especially on a small scale in your own home. Sometimes you might have a tree that gets uprooted and blown over. You could consider, if it's in a spot where you want it, just cutting off the trunk, and you could do something else with that wood. But you could keep the uprooted stump where it is and plant a garden around it. It becomes a beautiful sculptural element in the garden. And so we're going to go over here to this side. So these are actually logs that we were lucky enough to already have in this pocket of woods. So we kept them and reused them. I'm not sure what type of tree this was originally because all the bark is kind of decomposed off of it, and I can't really tell, but they've hollowed out and they just make great fun spaces. I don't know if you can see here the hollow, and if you look inside of there, which you don't have to with the camera, I'm not sure you'll be able to see it, but there are a lot of acorns and stuff in there, and if you sit in the garden, you can watch little chipmunks who will go through it and squirrels who will go through it and have a little feast in there. They're well protected inside this hollow log, so it kind of acts as like a freeway for them. It's pretty fun to watch. We're gonna move over to another part of the garden. We've got some friendly neighborhood chickens here. So they love to come here and forage. These are not our chickens, but a neighbor has some chickens that they let out, and 3 of them just love hanging out in the Stumpery. So never know what urban wildlife you're gonna see. So if you wanna come over here to this stacked log habitat wall, I'm gonna pan onto it for a minute. Here. So this is a really easy thing you could do in your own garden, is if you have some deadwood or even pruning limbs or a fallen tree, you could cut these logs up and stack them into a habitat wall. This is really fun because you could do this in any type of shape or form. You could combine other materials with it. You can even plug these with like mushroom spores and grow mushrooms in it. And also these cells that are created from where the rounds are stacked, you can fill those with soil and stick little plants in there. So they'll be trailing down and all that sort of kind of soften over time. So this is a really easy thing you can do in your garden. And if we're actually gonna turn the video around here in a minute, and you can see we've snaked these habitat walls, kind of like a serpentine wall through the rest of the glade, just to create a really fun form with it. And you'll see that some of the walls, they transition to pieces of granite, because over time, the bottom layer of this will start to kind of break down, get colonized with plants, and become kind of like a mounded, vegetated wall. We'll keep topping and rounding off the top with smaller limbs to keep the shape. But it's just a beautiful element over time to keep some of it with stone, because then you can just really see the shape through the time as everything ages and softens. So you can turn around and pan just over to the serpentine walls a little bit. And before we move on to the next spot, I just wanted to talk about one plant that's over here. I don't know if you want to come a little closer. So now that you've learned a lot about ferns, this is one fern that I wanted to talk to you about that we stuck here in the garden. So ferns in general are a really incredible family of plants. They are, gosh, there's about 12,000 ferns worldwide, I believe. The whole family has been around for at least 300 million years. And so they're actually older than the dinosaurs, for example. It's just an ancient, very broad range of plants. And this one here is called resurrection fern. That's the name it's known as. And you're like, hey, this looks dead. You're wrong. So this plant is really cool because it is an air plant, which means it attaches itself to the bark of another species. So it attaches, it spreads by spores, and it will start growing on the bark of another species. And so you'll see these a lot in Georgia. So where you see them here in Atlanta is a lot in the Chattahoochee National Recreation Area and some of the older oaks in the upland. Some of the oak species, their branches kind of create a hammock that kind of builds up this resurrection fern on the branches or on the trunks of that tree. Where you see this a lot is definitely coastal Georgia, often growing on trees with, can you see it? Often growing on the trees along with Spanish moss. Another place you really see it is in pecan farms in Georgia. So this is where these came from, actually. In a pecan farm, it was blown over in Hurricane Michael, and they were going to regrade and replant the farm. So Georgia Native Plant Society came out and cut up some of the logs and cut these into chunks to save them. But what's cool about this plant is it can completely lose almost all of its water, about 97% of its water. And just with a little bit of water, within about 24 hours, it'll spring back to life. And this is pretty incredible because most plants are gonna completely die if they lose maybe 8% of their water, but this plant can lose almost all of it and stay dormant for, we estimate, 100 years or so. So it's a pretty cool plant. And I meant to put water on this one a day earlier, but I forgot, so I put water on this morning, so it hasn't quite emerged yet. It takes about 24 hours, but you can see a difference in these. I don't know if you can see in the sun. This is already starting to green up and starting to unfurl. And within, probably by this evening, definitely by tomorrow morning, this is gonna look like a completely different plant. Very bright and green. So this is a really cool plant to have. We're hoping it crawls and spreads here, which is pretty neat because it's starting to do it here. All right, put these guys back. I'll keep moving on. We're gonna walk down here. The next plant I'm gonna talk about is this beautiful tree, at least beautiful to me right here. So this is a Prunus serratina. This is a black cherry tree. I don't know if you can see its fruits here. So this is a wild cherry tree. It's, related to the cherries that you buy in the grocery store, except its fruit is much smaller. It makes a really tiny little fruit. They're not ripe yet. They will get dark and soft and black. And you can eat them, but they're definitely not as sweet as our fruit that you buy in the store. They're very tart, but you can eat them. They make very delicious jams and jellies and syrup because once you add a bunch of sugar into it, mixed with the tartness, it has a really nice flavor. But they're a very popular fruit for wildlife for sure. Birds and mammals love this tree. They love this fruit. And I think before it sets fruit, it has this big droop of white flowers that's really beautiful and lovely. It can be considered a messy tree once again because of the fruit. And it's generally considered, once again, an early successional tree here, kind of growing in old fields and places like that, because the fruit is spread so rapidly. And but formerly it was a forest tree. This tree can live up to 250, 300 years old. Its bark here, I think, is actually really beautiful. It's got an exfoliating bark as it ages. But this tree actually, what makes it really interesting for a stumpery garden is that it can be, damaged in the wind pretty well. It's also in the rose family, so kind of related to all our fruits in that family, like peaches and pears and roses themselves. Anything in that family is a little bit more susceptible to getting a fungus that causes some decay, just because it's got a flower that's susceptible. But the thing with this tree is when it gets that decay from either that storm damage or that fungus, it actually decays kind of slowly in this tree, which, if you remember from the video, can create that hollow effect as this tree decays, which makes these great cavities for wildlife and as sculptural elements in your garden. And once this tree, if you've got a black cherry that's kind of on its way out, it would make a great tree to keep as a snag. You could cut off any of its branches that are overhanging that you might be worried about dropping on something. And of course, this is only if your tree is already determined to be like dead, dying, or hazard. So not do this to a healthy black cherry like this one. But on its way out, it can remain and create these beautiful hollowed pieces and be a great habitat tree. This tree also is an incredible wildlife tree. It supports, it's like 480 species, somewhere around there, of different caterpillars that create our butterflies and our moths. And that's really, really important because you can look up the research of Doug Tallamy, an ecologist who does this great research on why our native plants, and specifically our trees like this that support so many caterpillars, are essential for our birds, because baby birds have to eat caterpillars in order to, that's their primary food, in order to become a mature bird. So it's a great tree to have around to feed your birds if you're a bird lover. And we're going to move on to the next part in the stumpery. Here, this is another tree that is a tree you've definitely seen around Atlanta. It's called a hackberry. Some parts of the country also call it a sugarberry. And it's a Celtis levigata. So this tree, you can really recognize it because of the bark that's on it. It's got these really corky kind of pieces of bark that grow on the trunk that I think are really attractive and interesting as an aesthetic quality of a tree, and can make a really, really beautiful tree in the landscape. They're typically have the shape of an elm, which is kind of like this upright form, which is just a beautiful shape. And this one also has an edible fruit on it. It's not, I actually haven't had the fruit of this tree, so I can't confirm that it's tasty, but the name sugarberry also is because the tree is sweet. The fruit is sweet, so the fruit of it is supposed to be very, very sweet. It's just that the seed inside the fruit is very big, so there's not a lot of fruit on it. But it is supposed to be very tasty. Of course, wildlife love this tree as well. It doesn't support as many caterpillars as the black cherry does. This one has about 47 that it supports, but that's still pretty good. The other black cherry is just really good. And the other thing with this tree is that it is not commonly planted in the landscape, even though it's really tough and it actually can take a lot of urban conditions, is because the fruit is messy. Once again, people don't want to plant it over a driveway or something that can stain. you know, the fruit gets on there and you'd have to clean it off. So I wouldn't recommend it for planting over a driveway or a patio or something like that. But in a backyard or somewhere where you're not worried about the fruit, it would make a great tree. The other reason why it's not commonly planted is because it gets an aphid, which is an insect that it feeds on kind of the sap of the tree. It sucks out some of the sap from like the veins and leaves, and it secretes this substance called honeydew. And the honeydew, it's kind of this, it's like sugar water. And it coats the leaves, but it can coat anything that's underneath it. So if you've gotten that sticky substance on a car, it could have very likely been honeydew from a tree like this. So that's another reason you wouldn't want to do it over a driveway or something like that. But somewhere where you're not worried about those things, it's a beautiful tree and very tough. And the other thing with the honeydew is if you're not worried about it, it actually is an important food for a lot of our native bees. Actually, there was a study in California that 40 native bees and honeybees as well, but 40 native bees used the honeydew species of this tree. So it's a great wildlife. You can actually eat the honeydew. I don't know if you want to, but it tastes like sugar. It's pretty interesting. I don't know if you want to pan to this one here and show the shape. You have a question?
Yes, we do have a question from the chat. What resources would you suggest to help find those statistics of how many caterpillars different tree species support?
Yeah, so that is Doug Tallamy's research. So he is an ecologist at the University of Delaware. He's got a great website. He also has published several books. Kind of a great one to get started with that is Bringing Nature Home. And it's a great book. And he's got all of his science laid out in there, and it's very good. And he approaches it using the science, but also at a very a level where you don't have to be an ecologist to understand. So that's a great place to go and look for it. Any other questions right now? Okay, cool. Thanks. So this hackberry tree is a pretty unique thing that happens because the tree branch here at one point in time split. And so it kind of fell and it started growing back. So we get this great like whimsical sculpture of the tree that's going on in here. I can't guarantee that is not going to happen with every tree, but sometimes it gives you an idea of ways. If a tree branch that kind of splits off is not completely damaged, you might be able to kind of patch it back or stake it up and support it on one side, and it could grow and create this really cool climbable type of tree. So that's just a lucky feature we already had in the Stumpery. So we'll go over here and look at this. So this is just an easy thing, another thing you can do, and with your logs in the garden, or even go and source some logs. And this is just cutting them up in various pieces and kind of creating some beds, stacking different pieces of logs into it and filling it with some soil. It gives you this great place to plant. So you could plug it with mushroom spores once again. You can stick shrubs in there, perennials, vegetables, whatever you want. It's also good for the plants because as these stumps kind of decay and release, they're going to provide that nutrient and compost for the plants. And it just will soften and get more beautiful over time. So this is a really easy thing you could do at your own home. Just even if you see some stacked logs on the right of way, someone is waiting for an arborist to come get their limbs, you could go and just grab some of them and start playing around in your own garden. You can also use smaller pieces of this and actually use it to line garden beds. So you can use it as an edging as well, in the same way that you would use, say, like brick or stone or something like that. Just reusing the wood. It's good for your soil, and it looks really neat as well. So we're gonna move on to the next part. I don't know if you can show this wall. We're actually going to do a cool thing here. This is a species of that sugarberry, the hackberry we talked about. We planted some small ones in here, and we are going to play around in the future with actually some of the limbs, actually staking them in a certain way to allow kind of a little bit of like the wonky growth of the tree, just as a fun element in the garden, and to kind of keep creating those environments for cavities and snags to form, so we can keep having those in the garden in the future. Yeah, I don't know if you want to pan a little bit of the wall in there, see if it's not confused. Our next tree we're going to talk about is over here. So this tree here is another tree that is common all over Atlanta. I kind of wanted to show you all these trees that are like our common trees, and just trees we kind of see as expendable or trash trees. Sometimes people consider them as like weedy trees. I love them for so many reasons, but they are especially useful in settings like this. This one is the water oak. I know you probably are all familiar with this. So this tree is a very fast growing oak tree. It's very useful for restoration projects, wetland restoration projects, because it grows very, very quickly. It makes a lot of seed. It's got really tiny acorns, and it's prolific at making seed. This tree can get, average water oak lives maybe 60 to 80 years. So it grows really quickly. I mean, they can be massive size. And it is pretty susceptible to like wind and disease. And almost any water oak, probably by the time it's middle age, has some form of cavity forming inside of it. So it can make great snag trees. We have so much of it in Atlanta. So it makes a great type of wood to use in the Stumpery garden. You can even chunk up the pieces of this tree, and the hollow portions of it you can almost use as a planter. You can set it somewhere and let it fill it with garden soil and plant it with plants, and it just creates this cool, almost a pot outside. It'll drain out the bottom the same way. I've seen chunks of wood like that just sitting on the sidewalk or on the right of way, all the time around Atlanta. So you can just grab one of those and bring them back home if you don't have some water oak. The acorns of this tree too are just, like I said, they make so many of them that I'm sure you've seen squirrels running around everywhere bearing these acorns. But they're also in a forest and in a wetland, they're really popular with certain birds. Even like wild turkey love them, and bobwhite quail, and species of ducks as well. So it's and oaks, gosh, and going to the caterpillars as well. Oaks are, out of all of the trees, when you look at Doug Tallamy's research, Quercus, which is the oak, is the top. It's considered the pinnacle of a wildlife tree that you can have. It supports, I believe, 519 different species of caterpillar. So it's a great tree to have, any species of oak for wildlife. If you're planting an oak, typically we'd recommend planting a longer living oak, like a white oak or a southern red oak or scarlet oak, and so many oak species. It's typically not a water oak, but it is very useful in a restoration project. Yeah, I think we've got a question.
All right, so our next question is, are termites a concern when putting a stumpery near your home?
So I probably wouldn't. I don't think there's been a lot of research on how much is that going to transmit into like your home or your foundation. It's pretty unlikely that they're going to go into your walls when they have a perfect habitat like this to live in already. But if you're concerned about that, I wouldn't put a stumpery like right next to your foundation or home. I'd space it out a little bit. But there's so much space and so much healthy life that you're creating in a little ecosystem like that, that it keeps all those insects in check. So if you're wanting to do this, I just maybe wouldn't recommend right against your home. But yeah, you're creating this great ecosystem. Any other questions? Okay. I think that's it for the water oak. We're gonna go over to this next portion of the garden. So this is kind of the garden element finale, which this is something you can certainly do as well if you end up with some really large pieces of wood or you're working on a project somewhere in a public space. So we built what we call a throne here out of these wood species, which is just this giant bench. I'm sure you've seen different sculpture and art that happens with wood. If you've got a really big stump, you can actually have like an artist come in with a chainsaw and they'll actually make a sculpture of something neat. You can have furniture built in. I've even seen some of these big logs like that, actually a throne carved out of the upright portion itself. So this is a great thing you can do in your own, if you have something that's this size in your own home. So we call this the throne. It's a pretty great place to come and check out the stumpery and spend some time. Get a shot of it. We got a question.
All right, so our next question is, do you find that chiggers take up residence in the dead wood, or is that just a fear?
Yeah, I actually haven't experienced that. You know, I guess it's possible. I really think of actually more with stone. I encountered chiggers more. I think the environment might be a little too moist for them. I'm not actually too familiar with like the life cycle of the chigger, but personally, no, I really haven't had bad experience with the chiggers in the wood. So feel free to ask any more questions. We're just going to talk about a couple more tree species here, just because we're here. One of them here is one of my all-time favorite trees. If you can get its flower here, I don't know if you can. Oh, look, and we've even got a little friend in there. Actually, he's like a stink bug, but I don't know if you can see these tiny little things moving in this. Can you? Well, here. So this tree is a big leaf magnolia. It's Magnolia microphylla. This tree is, I love it. It smells really, really good if you're standing right here. So this tree is related to like our southern magnolia that you might be more familiar with, but it's not an evergreen tree. It's deciduous, so it means it drops its leaves in the winter. This tree is still getting established here. So this leaf size is not very representative, but this leaf size of this tree is actually, it has the largest simple leaf, which means one leaf, not like a leaf that's on a blade like this or a panicle, but it's this leaf can get up to 2 feet long, which is a huge leaf. And it's just kind of like these really floppy. I almost think of them as like animal-like, just in their floppiness. And it's a really soft leaf, and it's just such a tropical looking tree, but it is native to our area. It's usually found in more like rich kind of bottomland type forests, maybe not quite right in the water, but in that rich, moist ravine. You can see these a lot actually also at the Chattahoochee or any of our kind of bigger river watersheds like that, river valleys. And it makes these beautiful flowers at this time. And why you see kind of, I don't know if you can see these little crawling things on it, but this old genus as well. I don't believe quite as old as the ferns, but it actually uses things like beetles to pollinate it, because the flying insects like our butterflies and things had not evolved at that time. So it attracts like little tiny beetles. Don't worry, you're not going to get like giant beetles that you might be afraid of. It's these little things that you can hardly see to pollinate it. And it's just this really, really beautiful tree to have in your landscape. And I'm very partial to them because I love them. And I just think they're very sculptural looking, and which is why it's here in the garden, because I put it there. Another tree that we have here is actually, this is a box elder. So we call it a box elder, but it's actually in the maple family, Acer negundo. And this is also an extremely common tree, almost in any landscape. It's very early successional, and it can be used in restoration projects as well, but very rarely planted because it spreads itself so well, and we're not going to have any seed on it yet, but it makes a unique seed. If you've seen those little seeds that look like wings, and you might see them spit like helicoptering through the air and flying, that's a maple seed. And it makes this little wing in order to let the wind spread its seed to a new place. And it gets these, and it's really effective at spreading, especially in watershed areas. It's a pretty short-lived tree. It can get pretty gnarled bark, and a lot of snags can form in it, which is actually really neat. We can actually look at, if we go over here, I'll point to this tree. If you can see it from here, that big mass of a tree over there, you can see the kind of dead branches at the top. Is actually a box elder, and the whole top of it is filled with woodpecker cavities, because this wood is just really easy for them to carve out, and it is so short-lived, it will start developing those branches that kind of die back and create this gnarled wood that are great for a stumpery garden. We'll go over here. If we have some time, we'll talk about another tree. Or maybe we'll go in the sun to where you can see this better. So these were planted in here. There's some things that have been planted, but just kind of before we put the stumpery in, and now we have a second wave of planting to do in June. But these were planted before, and these are all mayapple. So this plant is what we call a spring ephemeral, which means it emerges in the late winter. And it's really interesting when it starts emerging from the ground. It almost starts growing up like you would think a mushroom does. But it emerges early, and the reason why spring ephemerals do this is because the tree canopy has not leafed out yet. And so they can catch a lot more sun. The canopy in the winter is still open. There's a lot more sun hitting the ground. and they can emerge, set their leaves early, and start to photosynthesize and make food for itself. If they were to wait, say now when all the canopy and the leaves have leafed out, there's a lot less sun for them in the forest, and they can't get enough food in order to set flowers and make fruit and reproduce. So they will actually, they're kind of like a little bit past their peak now. They look great in April, start kind of emerging February, March, depending on where you are. And they just cover the ground and they'll spread and create these great groves. And once it starts getting warmer, these are actually going to go dormant and kind of recede back into the ground, just because they've completed their life cycle. They're called mayaples. They have a flower and they set this fruit over here, which you can see. So they've kind of already completed their life cycle at this point in the early summer, because they've set their fruit. Kind of looks like a little avocado or fig. I believe something about this plant is edible. I would look it up. I don't really know. I haven't tried to eat this. Something about maybe the seeds are not edible, but the fruit is. Some parts toxic, some parts not. So, you know, you would look that up before you would quote me on that. But it is just a beautiful, beautiful plant to have here in the woodland. And the chickens are really enjoying it. Yeah, I think we have some questions.
All right, so we do have a couple more questions. One is, what are the dimensions of this garden? And are there any size limitations, too large or too small for a garden like this?
I couldn't hear that. Dimensions of the garden?
Mm-hmm.
Gosh, I am not entirely sure off the top of my head the length and the width. It's about 12,000 square feet, this plot total.
Are there any size considerations that you need to make for too large or too small?
No, you could do this any way you want. It could be as small as, you know, getting one chunk of hollow wood and filling it with soil and planting some plants in it. You could build on to that if you liked it. Or, you know, if you have an uprooted root wad, you might have a larger area that you could start with. You could also just start with a small stacked wall, expand it if you want. So, I mean, it's really versatile and whatever kind of works for your space.
Okay. Do you think that more logs will be added down the road as the current ones decay? Or is the plan to allow the garden to grow naturally using the wood as a basis for growth?
Yeah, both actually. So as the stacked logs kind of decay, the bottom layer is going to decay a little bit more rapidly than the top layer and kind of turn into kind of like a earthen wall that will be colonized with plants. And we are going to leave that. We're not going to take it away and put it back, but we are probably going to keep rounding off the top to keep shape, at least for the next, you know, maybe the first couple of times when it decays, and add some pruning, probably some smaller logs on top to stack them in and keep the shape of some pruning limbs, and just kind of keep the tops rounded off. You certainly, it depends on what you want aesthetically. You could kind of replace or, you know, just keep rounding it off over the time if you want to keep some wood elements in it. It just kind of depends on your aesthetic preference.
Okay. So just as a reminder to everyone in the chat, the Beltline is open now, but there are social distancing requirements that are in effect. So we ask that you pay attention to that. You can find those guidelines also on the Beltline's website. Are there any more questions? We have a couple of minutes left in our tour this morning. Feel free to go ahead and type them in. Okay.
Thank you guys so much for joining us. This was wonderful. Come check this out. It's a great space. It'll be fun to watch and see it change over everything established and grow in, especially over the next couple of years. So we thank you guys. You good?